Ready to go.
Great.
We are still in Romans 11. Although making pretty good progress. Seems people are more interested in it than I would have anticipated, which is great. We talked about this slide at the beginning of last week. I'll probably put it up here more. The more I read Romans, the more I read Acts, Luke, Acts and Romans, I realize how much of those books, and they are related, are infused with Isaiah and so much of the New Testament. It's not just Luke, but really all the Gospels are, and the life of Jesus is infused with the portrait that is portrayed of the what we now know to be a suffering Messiah, not just a suffering servant, that you see painted in Acts over the course of many chapters. Some sort of climaxed in chapter 53. We could go back and study that chapter, but if you've done a study of one of the Gospels correctly, particularly Luke, you've already studied Isaiah 53. And if you can manage to get through Luke without thinking about Isaiah 53, you should probably go back and start over again. See what you missed. Anyway, let's take a look at where we're at. We don't have anybody new here, so I don't really have an excuse to summarize anything. Oh yeah, we're gonna go back and revisit this right here. This is good. I mentioned, we came up last week about the renaming of or the name Palestine for the land that the state of Israel sits on. And where did it come from? And it came from, I went back and looked it up a little bit. There's two rebellions of the Jews during the Roman period. The first one, there were other little uprisings, but the two rebellions were the ones that started in 66, lasted to 70 when Jerusalem got destroyed. We've talked about that. And that's often called the Great Jewish War or something like that. That's the one that Josephus wrote about. And basically, he's the only person that we really know about it from, I think. But then there was also the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 132. And that was the one under Hadrian. That's when the Romans said, we've had enough of this. And so they banned the Jews from living in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. I thought it was further than that, but that's.
They just kicked them all out?
Well, they had already wiped them out. Oh. And they said, you're not coming back. Don't bother trying to come back. Yeah. Which would explain why that land was kind of vacant up until the mid 1800s. Mark Twain commented on it. He went over there and was struck by how empty the land was. There's just nobody there. Anyway, what happened was they wanted to get rid of this idea of Jewish identity, I think. And so they replaced they dropped the name Judea and they replaced it with Syria Palestina. Basically thinking of it as an extension of a province of Syria. And Jerusalem was made a Roman colony. That's one way to eradicate Jewish identity there, turn it into a Roman colony. And so that's how it happened. It became Syria Palestina. And I don't know why I have this open now, because I just described it to you. Interesting. Especially in light of what's going on in the world today. I don't think any of what I've just said is very debatable. It begins to begin when you start talking about the land being empty, that implies some things, and that's when it starts getting debatable. Because that's when you start getting into the questions of who does the land belong to. Anyway, back to Romans 11. I will successfully steer my way from that little minefield that we were just headed towards. We're on about verse 11. I think we are in the middle of this section where Paul is about to conclude his 3-chapter dissertation on what about Israel. Let's just sum it up that way. What's going to happen? What's happened to Israel? What are the implications of Israel's rejection of the Messiah, and then what Paul says straight out is God's rejection of Israel in response. And does that mean then we have a new people of God that's Gentile, and Israel has been replaced with this Gentile people of God? And that's the issue that he's dealing with here, I think. which can then lead to, particularly in a very, very class-oriented, social class-oriented society, that leads to arrogance, especially when these Jews are making their way back to Rome in the ensuing 10 years or something like that. They come back and now they're the second-class citizens. Well, they used to be the case that in the synagogues, the Gentiles were the second-class citizens under Moses. But now in Christ, maybe these people think that the Jews are the second-class citizens under Christ, the prophet like Moses. I don't know. This is all inference based on what Paul talks about. There has to be a reason why he suddenly decided he's going to partially, some kind of accusation that the Gentiles in the Roman church are arrogant, are being arrogant in some way. Because why would he just do not be arrogant? Usually you say, don't be arrogant to people who are being arrogant. That's how that works. And that's the mode that he's in right now, which is an interesting one for a guy who's never been in Rome, who doesn't have any status, so to speak, within the church. Although we're going to find out at the end of the letter that he certainly knows some Christians in Rome, two of whom are Aquila and Priscilla, who he met in Corinth. Okay, and then we went through what Israel was seeking. It's like the third time he said something like this. It has not obtained. What it was seeking is something like the righteousness that can be found in the law, the righteousness about which Paul, in describing himself, said that he was blameless, which to him accounted for nothing. That he was blameless according to the law. He was blameless, and he threw all that away to pursue the righteousness that is in Christ through faith. And so what they were pursuing in the law, they did not find. In Moses, they did not find. But the Gentiles who were not pursuing it, but instead were pursuing idols, did find it. They did find righteousness. But they found the righteousness of Christ, not the righteousness which could be obtained through human doing by law keeping. And so we see then the outward manifestation, the outward result of the overthrow, if you will, of Moses. The supremacy of the law comes to an end. Not law. We're not lawless. It's not the end of law per se, but the supremacy of the authority of the law, wherein you are enslaved to it, which then causes your sin nature to be able to use it to enslave you to sin and thereby result in condemnation. That dynamic has been overthrown by Christ and the indwelling Spirit. And so now, through Christ, we are not under law, the law. We are bound to Christ through the Holy Spirit. He is the binding, he joins us to Christ and is the binding presence of Christ himself inward, by which we internalize the righteousness of Christ. The Spirit indwells us, and through the Spirit then, Christ indwells us. And we have, therefore, the righteousness of Christ internalized. And now the project is the externalizing, if you will, of that internalized righteousness of Christ. The reshaping of the human character by the further manifestation of the righteousness of Christ, which is internalized, rather than the pursuit of law keeping. That's kind of how I understand Romans, let's call it 7 and 8 or something like that. But of course, now if righteousness is not obtained through the law, but through faith, and Moses is overthrown, so to speak, so the Gentiles do not have to submit to Moses. That was the council in Jerusalem in chapter 15 of Acts that Paul put his foot down on, and Barnabas. If that's the case, and Israel has rejected its Messiah, and God has rejected Israel thereby, what of Israel? Is God simply done with Israel? And Israel has been replaced, and so the promises made to Israel through Abraham are nullified for Israel. That's the question he's dealing with. Any questions or comments about that? Okay, so then it's interesting. Romans 9 through 11 is some of the most text-heavy writing in Paul. I was writing down the list of all the, I may have done it somewhere in here. Somewhere in here, I list out the, I guess not. I started to do it and then I probably just threw it away. How many Old Testament quotations there are in Romans 9 through 11? It's quite astonishing. I mean, you would think he'd quote the Old Testament in those other passages, but he does it in 9 through 11. 2 of them are right here, 3 of them. Israel did not find what it was seeking, did not obtain what it was seeking, but those who were chosen, the remnant, we'll get back to that word that we talked about last week with Elijah and his problem with the Israelites. God saved a remnant of 7,000. History rhymes. Here we are again. God has saved a remnant from within Israel. Those are the ones who were chosen. They obtained it, but not through Moses, rather through faith in Christ, obtaining therefore the righteousness of Christ, which could not be obtained through Moses, and the rest were hardened. Very harsh statement. As it is written, at the hands of God this happened. God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to see not, and ears to hear not, down to this very day. And what Paul now has done, of course, down to this very day, is this, which one is this? This is, Deuteronomy 29. This is Moses talking. Moses is early. Moses is before the land. And we're talking 1,400 years earlier, right at the beginning. Paul uses Moses' ideas and comes up with this, only Moses is talking about the people of his day. God has not given you eyes to see or ears to hear. Israel, you have non-seeing eyes and non-hearing ears, non-hearing ears. So do what he says, keep the law, do not depart from it. You'll continue to experience the blessings. You are entirely dependent on God, who has not given you eyes to see or ears to hear. To this day, Moses' day, Paul takes to this day and extends it 1,400 years into the present day and reapplies it to the Israel that is alive at his time. And he's saying nothing has changed. Now, under the prophet like Moses, it's exactly the same thing. God has not given them eyes to see or ears to hear down to this very day. That's why they rejected their Messiah. Not because they didn't have enough information, not because they decided they wanted to go off in a different direction after careful consideration, but because they were at the mercy of God, just like they were 1,400 years earlier, and he has chosen not to do it. He saves a remnant. Instead, he saves a remnant for the moment. And then he quotes David in the Psalms. So you can see these reapplications of well-understood texts from the traditions now through Jewish eyes, Paul's eyes, Pharisaical, Mosaic Jewish eyes, Paul, now taking those passages and applying them to Israel as he looks out through his eyes in his time. Okay, does anybody want to stop me yet? It's 9:38. Nobody wants to stop me because I've done all the talking so far, and I haven't got to my notes. Well, I'm going to look at my notes first. Oh yeah, we're kind of in a new section here. He does this. He'll say some things, and then he'll have a sort of summary. Well, what do we make of all this kind of statement? He does this frequently, and what you're getting then is constraints, because when a biblical author does that, it's like God saying, now you humans' minds like to go in all your different directions, and you're going to take from this whatever you want to take. And I know you're going to do that. So I'm not going to take any chance that you're going to miss my point. And I'm going to tell you straight up what I want you to get out of this. That's the thing to get. It's a Bible study. It's a learning disability on the part of humans. We ask questions of texts that they were not meant to answer and not designed to answer. So if you want to do good Bible study and want to understand the Word of God, find out what questions the writer's trying to answer and then ask those questions. And you'll go right every time. In this case, neither God nor Paul takes a chance, and he simply asks the question that you're supposed to ask, and then he answers it. What then? Did they stumble so as to fall? No, may it never be. If this is all true, if Israel's been rejected, I know what you should be thinking. God has rejected Israel. Is that true? May it never be. No, he has not rejected his people. That's the answer to the question. It's a very, very simple question, implication of the text, question to ask, and then a straightforward answer of no, he has not rejected his people. Can everybody see that? Verse 11, that's what's going on there. But notice that he changes pronouns here. It's the little things. I say then, they, the Jews, the nation Israel, did not stumble so far as to fall, did they? Well, what are the implications of that? The implication is he's talking explicitly to Gentiles. I guess he could be talking to saved Jews. But it doesn't appear in the text that that's where he's headed. He appears to be talking to the Gentiles in the church, which either means he just wants to talk to Gentiles for a minute. He's setting aside the Jews. There's not a lot of Jews in the church, which would also explain then if there's not a lot of Jews and Gentiles have the numbers, they're just going to lord it over the Jews in the body of Christ. But anyway, he seems to be wanting to talk to Gentiles at this point. Whether he's always been, we don't know. That's kind of my thinking. This has always been a dialogue with Gentiles. It's been a dialogue about Judaism, about Moses, about Israel, about the law with Gentiles for the most part. That's what I think. And we already talked about this Hellenistic culture, this Greco-Roman, heavily Greek cultured empire was so laden with social stratification. You could hardly know what to think of a person until you knew what class he was in. You had to put him in the right. You found out what class he was in first, so that then you could know how to think about him. You didn't think about him first and estimate him. You got it the other way around. You needed to know that you were talking to a slave. Probably they wore clothes that indicated they were slaves. You needed to know that you were talking to a Roman, so you don't make a mistake. You know you're below him potentially. That's exactly what two different people needed to know about Paul in Acts, and he finally let them know. Right? In Philippi, he gets beaten, him and Silas, who was also a Roman, got beat, they got thrown in prison. That's the story about the angel and the earthquake and so forth. And next day they come out, they say, okay, you guys can go. No. Look what you did. I'm a Roman. I know how this works. He wants us to leave. He comes down here. He leads us out of this city publicly so I can humiliate him as a Roman. That's exactly what happened. And then he said, I'm reading between the lines here. And then he said, you know what? And I feel like going over here and seeing this woman that I wanted. So you guys wait. I'm going to go over here and visit with this woman for a while on the way out of the city. So he went and did that. Then he left the city. I think that's what's going on. I mean, it's just, I'm probably carrying it farther than I should, but it's certainly maybe I'm projecting, because that's what I would want to do if I was. But he certainly publicly humiliated the officials who threw him in jail. And then there was the jailer. Then there was the centurion who found out at the last second when he was in Jerusalem in 22 of Acts, I think 21, 22, 22. That when they were about to give him the scourge, he asked, "Is it lawful to scourge a man who's a Roman and uncondemned?" What? Wait, what? Says the centurion. So he takes off and he goes to the tribune. What are you doing? This man's a Roman. As soon as they found out he's a Roman, everybody backs off. Not because he's great, but because there's rules in their society for that social class. That's a legal class, Roman. And you don't do that sort of thing on many, many penalties. So they had this little debate, him and the tribune, who of course was also a Roman and a former slave, by the way. And that's when Paul says, they're trying, who's got the higher status Romanosity? Well, you still got to figure this out, Paul. I don't know whether I got to know. I'm still above you, Paul. Even in the world of Romans, I'm still above you. I got my citizenship by paying a large sum. Paul pulled out the trump card. I was born a Roman. Oh, but they established these things. That's the etiquette. That's how it works. They finally established it. And so, okay. So that's when the Tribune had him taken to Caesarea on the coast to get him out of Judean territory, because Caesarea is in Samaritan territory, and off they go. Anyway, that's the nature of social status in the Roman Empire. That's worth reading about. It's fascinating stuff. Let's see. So maybe the Gentiles were doing this to the Jews. And it's natural. You see it in Corinth. Paul has to do something about that at the Lord's table, which is this manifesto of unity, meant to be a manifesto of unity for the church, as people from all different backgrounds, slave, Roman, whoever, come together and sit at the same table and eat bread that they hand around or something like that, but sit at the same table. If you're a Roman, you do not have table fellowship with a slave. Well, look at the central ritual, if you will, in the Christian. It's not an accident in the Christian tradition. Table fellowship, potentially of a Roman and a slave. Guy could be a senator and his slave. The Philemon and Onesimus at the same table. It's an astonishing picture once you understand something about that world. Next explanation of why, another reason why I'm into it. But anyway, that's the situation. Doug Moo reading his commentary. What's the point here? It's very simple. Israel's rejection by God at the hands of God is neither total nor final. He's saving a remnant now, and there's more for the future. He's going to get to that later in the chapter. So Gentiles, this is Moo talking, Gentiles can rejoice at being included with Israel, but they cannot boast that they have replaced Israel. And there is a prominent theological position on that today, that the church replaces Israel. I don't come down on that. I don't come down on that side, and this is three chapters of why I don't come down on that side.
You mean like when you read in the Bible that God's going to do this for Israel, they think it means the church, not Jews.
And I should probably, people who believe in covenantalism, I should probably go read them better, because I don't like to get my enemies wrong, so to speak, my adversaries, my opponents, those whom I disagree with, what do you call that person? Not an enemy, but a interrogator, the guy on the other side of the argument. You always want to be fair with that guy. He might be your own brother or the guy who lives next to you, who mowed your lawn for you or something like that. So, you want to get them right. You want to understand their position fairly and then disagree if you can. Someday, he is going to say, Paul, God will remove his hardening and Israel will again be the recipients of the covenant blessings as Israel, not just as what he calls the remnant here. So the gospel's advance will then come full circle and embrace Israel.
So is that what verse 12 is talking about? That talks about transgression, failure, and fulfillment.
Ooh, you got a little makings of a sermon there or something. Say that again.
They talk about the transgression and failure, but then the fulfillment. Is that referring to the Jews rejecting Christ, but it is riches for the Gentile, but then later it says how much more will their fulfillment be? Yeah,
let's go ahead and read this whole section then, 11, which I didn't think I've done yet. 11 through, I'm actually going to cut this off at 15. The New American Standard has 16 as part of the thought in scope, the thought of what starts at 11. You can see how it's, I don't know, is it transitional? Is it an intro statement to what's coming, or is it a concluding statement to this thought here? I'm just kind of curious. Let's go take a look at what are the Catholics doing with this? Look what they do. They do it the other way. They move that down to the next section. Kind of makes a difference a little bit. There's this debate. There's no way to tell other than you just have to carve it up the way you think it makes sense in English. And it's not going to change the world, thinking in one way to change the text, thinking one way or the other. It's just, anyway, I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? May it never be. That's the last of his may it never be's. I think there's 11 of them or so in this book. This is the last of them. But by their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. Now, if their transgression is riches for the world, because now salvation has come to the Gentiles through their transgression, and their failure is riches to the Gentiles, those two words are synonymous from the Jewish point of view, the world and Gentiles. In their mind, when they say the world, they're excluding Jews are not that. Jews are something different from the world. How much more will be their fulfillment or fullness or even full number be? Now he's transcended the idea of remnant. He's talking about a time when Israel's salvation will be far greater than a remnant. But I am speaking to you who are Gentiles, inasmuch I am speaking to you who are Gentiles, and inasmuch then as I am an apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. Let me throw something in here, but never forget that I'm a Jew. I magnify my ministry to Gentiles. I am not just an apostle to the Gentiles. I am the apostle to the Gentiles. And to the extent that I am, I magnify my ministry. But by blood, I'm a Jew. As he said very clearly twice. My heart's desire is for their salvation. So it's just a tremendous identification with Israel. I am not lying. My conscience testifies with me in the Holy Spirit. I have great sorrow and unceasing grief in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were accursed, separated from Christ for the sake of my brethren, not the Christian brethren, Israelites, my kinsmen, according to the flesh, who are Israelites, to whom belongs the adoption as sons, glory and the covenants, giving of the law and the temple service, the promises, whose are the fathers and mine, most importantly, from whom is the Christ, according to the flesh. Very close identification with Israel. So yes, inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, or the apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify that fact. But my heart's desire, in my heart, I'm still an Israelite. And I pray for I want their salvation. So in spite of all the hostility he's received from Jews, if they en masse turn to Christ right then and there, he would absolutely celebrate and be dancing around the synagogue. In verse 25, he will refer to a fullness of the Gentiles. So here it's looking forward to the fullness, the full number of Israel. Later on in 25, that event, the full number of Israelites of Israel, will be postponed until the full number of the Gentiles comes in. That's what it's waiting for. That's the master plan. But there's some kind of numeric nuance going on here, which we're not going to get too far into. One of my observations on this is one of the very great ironies of the history of redemption is that the Gentiles, according to the Old Testament, the Jews would play a pivotal role in the salvation of the Gentiles. They did, just not the way they intended. They played a pivotal role by rejecting the Christ, which opened them the door to the Gentiles. But what wasn't in there was that the Gentiles would play a pivotal role in the salvation of Israel, because eventually the full number is going to come in, and Israel will then, after that event, that's what they're waiting for. And then after that event will follow the conversion, if you will, of Israel. That's the great plan.
Is it going to be like during the tribulation or something?
Uh-oh, you're trying to systematize.
Oh, well, I just wondered if it's going to be more toward the end of time.
Yeah, let's go with that. It's going to signal some kind of climactic period in salvation history. Yeah. Its relation to things like the tribulation, that's hard.
Mhm.
That's tough stuff. I don't have strong opinions about that.
Before the Lord makes everything right.
Yeah, I think so. I think, yeah. It's, I've taught Roman, and I've taught Revelation in this class, but I still know what to do with it. It's so hard to systematize Revelation with First and Second Thessalonians, with Matthew 24 and 25, with, these other passages, try to come up with a single system on that. It's really difficult to do.
It'll all make sense someday.
Okay. Here he speaks explicitly to the Gentiles, right? But I am speaking to you who are Gentiles. I am speaking to you as Gentiles, a class of people, says the Roman. I'm speaking to Gentiles as opposed to Jews. And as much then as I am apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. Because I speak to you as Gentiles because I'm the apostle to the Gentiles. But I'm an apostle to the Gentiles, but I'm not one. I'm a Jew. It's the great ambassadorship of Christ, right? The handshake of reconciliation comes from Jews to the Gentiles. They cross that. The Jews are the ones that cross that sacred barrier, that chasm, like Peter and John did when they went to Samaria to welcome Samaria into the church. And they extended the right hand of fellowship to these Samaritans. And then they send out a letter from the council in chapter 15, and they extend the right hand of fellowship to all these Gentile churches. And we have a church come into being. That's Jew and Gentile. All right, I forgot where I am here. Let's see. For if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, now we can understand that. It's through their rejection of the Messiah and God's rejection of them that the gospel went to the Gentiles. In fact, let's just revisit that. I called it Palestine. I remember now. Remember last week I listened to that part of the feed this morning. That was painful to listen to as I was trying to hunt around and find the map that my favorite map. So hopefully this time I'm just going to find it. Look at that. There it is. Remember how this unfolded. He's in the middle of this, right? I mean, he's in the middle of the ministry. He's probably in Corinth. So this is unfolding in front of his eyes, that the Jews back in Jerusalem rejected their Messiah, propelling the gospel out into the frontiers of the Roman Empire from their perspective. And the first place it lands, of course, is Samaria. Who would have thought? If you'd have said to Peter before the death of Christ, you know what, you're going to be the vehicle. You and your people are going to be the vehicle for the salvation of the Samaritans. They would arrange their lives so they wouldn't happen. Just that scene where James and John, the brothers, Lord, the Samaritans rejected Jesus. Jesus is saying, hold that thought. That's not going to last forever. But the James and John said, well, you want us to call down fire from heaven. Who do these contemptible Samaritans think they are? We hate these people. They're down here. We're up here. We're Jews. They're Samaritans. And no, that's not the way it works. Then, maybe a few months later, I don't know, no more than a few years later, John finds himself hightailing his way up to Samaria so that he can welcome these Gentiles into fellowship with himself. And he had to have thought of it. He's walking there and he's going, look at me. Look what I'm doing here. I remember being around here before. That's not what I said when the last time I was here, but here look at me. I'm extending my hand out and I'm going to shake the hand of a Samaritan as an equal. That's transformative thinking going on there, right? You got a lot of things to change in the way you think. Okay. It's only 10 o'clock. We're doing okay. We're not getting anywhere in the text, but let's see. Rejection. This is an interesting thing. I talked before about the secular world of scholarship rejects the idea that a person who knew Paul could have written the book of Luke. I mean, the book of Acts. because they think the portrait you see in Acts is so unlike what you see of Paul in his letters that there's no way a person who knew Paul could have written that book. But here's another example of it. This word right here for rejection. Let's see. Rejection, where's the word? 15. Right there. That word occurs in Greek, that word occurs 2 times in the New Testament. Once here and once in the book of Acts, out of the mouth of Paul. When he says to the people on the ship on the way on during the shipwreck, not one life will be lost or fail or something like that. So here's a word that occurs twice in the New Testament, one time out of the mouth of Paul, 2 times out of the mouth of Paul, once in Romans and once in Acts. I'm just saying. That's interesting. That's 27:22, by the way, is the other place.
So can we use that word loss in place of affection?
Yes. Israel's loss. You probably wouldn't translate it that way because they're not really lost. They are rejected, but it's not permanent, but they haven't been lost. In English, lost is pretty final. On the other hand, I was lost, but then found in English. I don't have any more to say about that.
I would say that verses 13 to 15, that even though Paul is an apostle to the Gentiles, it's hard to go for the Jewish people to come back to God. Like it says, by any means I am provided to jealousy there. Those who are left and saved, some of them, though they're being cast away as a reconciling to the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? He's basically not giving, even though his main ministry is to the Gentiles, he's basically saying, I am not giving up on my people.
I forgot to read that. Thank you.
And, because that's, if you look at his ministry, what was the first place he went to when he went into a city? He went to the synagogue.
Always, yeah.
And it wasn't until later in his ministry that he finally said, okay, I'm done going to the synagogue because you guys aren't accepting the message.
Yeah, I don't know that he ever really did cut himself off from the synagogue because his final city was Jerusalem. And when he got to Rome, he couldn't go because he was under house arrest. So he had the Jews, the leader of the Jewish leadership in the area, come to him.
But who most likely didn't go? In Jerusalem, yes, he did go, but most of the other cities that he went to, he stopped going to the synagogue because they were just all he was going to argue with him and reject what he was saying. So
I didn't get a list yet. I should go make a list of all the synagogues he got kicked out of. I know he got kicked out of Pisidian Antioch, Corinth, Thessalonica. Philippi doesn't report a synagogue. Those are just the ones. Yeah. It's a pattern. He got rejected from the synagogues. That's the pattern. I don't remember if there's a synagogue mentioned in Ephesus. Look at the 2 uses of the word jealous here. So the plan is salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them, the Jews, jealous. So then he picks up on that word jealous. He says, I want a part of that. I want a part of that plan, part of the plan. If somehow I might move to jealousy, my fellow countrymen, not Israel, but my fellow, very, very personal, my fellow countrymen. It's very personal to him. So that I might save some of them. So there's kind of this optimism about the conversion of Israel. An ironic place to be at that point in history, especially given the animosity that they've shown him in city after city. But that's Paul. The salvation of a remnant is cause for celebration. How much more the salvation of the whole nation? Which doesn't necessarily mean every individual. We'll get back to that at some point. And that takes us to 16. Let's just read this. We won't finish it. Stop at 10:15. 16 through big section. 16 for a while. If the first piece of dough, this is highly Jewish, is holy, the lump is also, and if the root is holy, the branches are too. So he introduces his next, that's why I think it's intro. He's going to have a whole analogy here about a tree and a root and branches and so forth. And this is the intro. This is the way he introduces it in this highly Jewish kind of way. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you being a wild olive, there's two olives. So there's two olive trees. There's a natural olive. There's an olive tree, the one that the branches are on, and then there's the wild olive tree. Some of the branches on this olive tree were broken off, so that you, being a wild olive branch, could be grafted in among them and become partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree, whatever this olive tree is that he's talking about here. That sounds great. His next statement, do not be arrogant. So now we get into the idea that these guys may have thought of themselves as the new tree somehow. He dismissed the tree. The old olive tree is gone. That's Israel, and there's a new olive tree, and we're it. No, it's not. That's not the case. You are grafted branches. You were grafted into a tree that was not yours. And you were unfruitful, because that's the way wild olive trees were. They were unfruitful. That's kind of what made them wild. And so they were wild olive trees, wild branches on wild olive tree that were grafted into a fruitful, if you will, the fruitful olive tree, which will have its roots in Abraham, as we'll get to in a bit. Do not be arrogant, but if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. So now there's the root. And he's kind of completed the analogy. If the first piece of dough is holy, the lump is also, and if the root is holy, the branches are too. So we have to talk about that. You will say to me then, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. So now the Gentile is going to transition his argument. Okay, we're not a new tree that replaces the old tree. But hey, they broke branches off of that tree so I could be grafted in. So that makes me something. And he's going to respond with, quite right. They were broken off because of their unbelief, not your merit. But you stand by your faith. Do not be conceited, I repeat, but fear. Here's the harsh statement. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you. And all the modern evangelical Christians shudder as all the eternal security marbles clang around in their head like bumper cars. Behold then the kindness and severity of God. To those who fell, severity, but to you, God's kindness, if you continue in his kindness, otherwise you also will be cut off. Very harsh. It's difficult stuff. And if you say, well, he doesn't mean cut off. Well, he told him to fear. He told him to fear. I'm just a messenger, right? I'm just reporting it. That's what he told him to do, fear, because he cut them off. And why would you think he would cut them off for their unfaithfulness, but he won't do the same to you? And they also, now we're getting into it, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted back in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, fruitful olive tree, how much more will these who are the natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? And there you can see there's one olive tree of Jew and Gentile. It's a grand picture of the unity, if you will, the organic oneness of the people of God as he represents it by this olive tree that has its roots in Abraham, so to speak. Remember all that stuff in chapter 4 about how Gentiles become heirs of Abraham through faith, heirs of the promise made to Abraham through faith. He's just getting back to that now. You are made children of Abraham. You're not a separate thing. Like I said back in chapter 4, you're children of Abraham. I'm just going to use a different analogy to describe it. So I'm gonna, if I was going to try to figure this out, I'd say that the root is Abraham. Let's see, the natural branches, I don't know, are the remnant of Israel or something? I don't know. The natural branches that remain are the remnant. Maybe I'm thinking too hard about the analogy. And then the wild branches, of course, are the Gentiles. He says that explicitly. But the olive tree is Jewish from the root up. So the church in the new era springs from Jewish roots, right down to the bottom. And maybe that's why he says, you know, in opening this book, I am not ashamed of the gospel, is power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek or the Gentile. He's come full circle now, and he's probably commenting on that sort of thinking. Not that there's any more privilege, but it's just how things worked on the ground. Welcome aboard. But don't think you're taking anybody's place. You're not taking anybody's place. God is not rejecting his people. We get caught up here. In chapters 14 and 15, Paul's going to take up the issue of the reconciliation of Jewish and Gentile believers, which is further indication that he's actually is dealing with this issue. He probably wants this resolved before he gets there. I mean, are they going to do what happened in Corinth, where they're going to, where one side or the other is going to claim him? You know, the Gentiles can say, he's the apostle to the Gentiles, and he's ours. And the Jews can say, well, no, he's a Jew. He's ours, you know. That's what they were doing, something like that in Corinth. That's what you see in 1 Corinthians at the beginning. For the Gentiles, the story of Israel is not over. To the Jew first, and then to the Greek stands. Not, it used to be to the Jew first and then to the Greek, and then they rejected Christ, so now it's just the Greek, Gentile. No, it's to the Jew first and then to the Greek. So Moses does no favors for the Jew in Christ, but the promises were first given to the Jews. All right, that's enough. That'll do it. Okay, thanks for joining. Appreciate it. Yep.